Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I want to introduce you tonight to Fallon Farinacci. She wants to tell us a little bit about something called Red Dress Day and a Red Dress Walk. Fallon, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming. So tell me, what is Red Dress Day and Red Dress Walk all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So May 5th is Red Dress Day. It's a day to bring awareness and to honor missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited LGBTQIA+ folks.
Well, that's a mouthful. Let's go through that and unpack it in pieces, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So
missing and murdered Indigenous females. Okay, so that's certainly something that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission spoke about. There's been numerous studies about that, and the Red Dress Day is to bring awareness to that.
Yes, it is.
Yes. Okay, and then what's two-spirited?
Two-spirited within Indigenous communities. Two-spirited are folks who identify as two-spirited, and it can mean a variety of different things. It's something that the individual themselves would identify and explain how they are identifying themselves with.
Okay, so I had thought it was some people that thought that were bisexual. You're saying that's not equivalent to bisexual?
No.
Okay. So how would I think about two-spirited as, so it's people that think about themselves?
For myself, I'm not going to speak for everyone, but I have a friend who identifies as two-spirited, and they themselves use pronouns they, them, and then they identify as having both male and female, or sorry, I should say feminine and masculine energies. But again, that it's completely different for each individual.
Okay. And then LGBTQ?
Lesbian, gay, queer, questioning.
Okay. And so the Red Dress Day and the Red Dress Walk is to raise awareness for all of these different issues?
Yes, within the Indigenous community.
Oh, just within the Indigenous community. Okay.
Yes, specifically. So people who identify with as Indigenous, and then within LGBTQIA+, as well as women and girls. That's what that day is, to bring awareness and to honor those who are also missing and murdered.
And what are you going to do? You're going to, I've gone through parks and I've seen red dresses hanging from the parks, from trees. So is that part of what this day is about?
So yes, on May 5th, we're going to gather together at St. Catharines City Hall. This is the second annual walk. We did it last year for the first time within St. Catharines. And then we will walk down to the top of St. Paul Street, and we will head towards the Marilyn I. Walker building, the Brock University's building that's right behind the PAC Center in St. Catharines. On St. Paul Street, the dresses are currently already lined, hanging with red dresses from the posts. So those dresses have been borrowed from Brock University, and the Downtown Association for St. Catharines has worked together with Brock, the Niagara Regional Native Center, as well as the City of St. Catharines, to have these dresses be put up, and they will stay there until the end of May, and so that we can continue the conversation to bring awareness.
And is May 5th the date, across the province, across the country, or is May 5th just the right date in Niagara and St. Catharines?
That is the day across Canada as well as the US to bring awareness. Though, as I mentioned, the walk will start at 5:30, but in the meantime, at the Marilyn I. Walker building from 6 to 8 p.m., there will be an Indigenous artisans market as well. So folks can go there and support the artists either before the walk, or if they want to start the walk, but they can't or don't want to do the entire walk, then they're welcome to go and support the artists down at the Marilyn I. Walker building within the lobby there.
Why is this important to you?
I am a child survivor of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited LGBTQIA+. I testified for the National Inquiry for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls in 2017. And in 2019, I joined the National Family Advisory Circle, where I sat alongside other family members and survivors and worked closely with the commissioners. And in June of 2019, I was one of the family members who presented the nation and Justin Trudeau with the 231 calls for justice, as well as the final report. So for me, it's very personal. I witnessed the murders of both of my parents, and I want to ensure that our voices aren't silenced and that this ongoing genocide and the racism, discrimination, and violence that Indigenous peoples face in this country is heard, and that change needs to come, and that those 231 calls for justice need to be implemented as well and not sit on a shelf and collect dust. There is an implementation plan, but it's time that we start to actually implement the calls for justice.
Oh my God. You witnessed the murders of your parents.
I did, yes. My mother had a stalker, and unfortunately, due to many errors within the justice system, my parents were not protected, and my mother's stalker entered our home on January 27th of 1993 and held myself, my younger brother, my older brother, and my parents hostage before killing both of my parents and taking his own life.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. And was this in Niagara?
This was not in Niagara. So I am a proud Red River Métis. I was born and raised in Manitoba in a predominantly Métis community called Saint Eustache. This is where my father's side of the family is from. My mother is non-Indigenous. So that's how I ended up living in Niagara, was after my parents passed away. My father instilled in me at a very young age to be proud of who I was, who my ancestors were. He was the president for the Manitoba Métis Federation, specifically for our local in the Saint Eustache community. And so I was always around my traditions and cultures. And after my parents passed away when I was 9 years old, I had to move here. So we were displaced. And when we moved here to Niagara, there's a lot of politics within Métis nations. And so I essentially lost a lot of my cultures and traditions due to that. I went home every summer. I was very lucky to be able to go home. I still have my community back in Manitoba that claims me. And I have a community here in Niagara now as well that I consider my family and my friends. So I'm not without by any means. I have lots of support, but what happened to my parents and the failures within the justice system needs not to happen again. One of the many failures that happened was that my mother told the RCMP not once but twice she was concerned that her stalker had a .22 caliber rifle, and there was no seizure of any weapons, and there was not a search of his home, and he did in fact use that same .22 caliber rifle to kill both of my parents and himself. The night of my parents' death, the original 911 call went in. The first one went in at 2:30 in the morning. When the constable was informed of what was happening, he informed the two officers to come out to our home and speak to my mother's stalker by name because they knew him. He was known to the RCMP in our community. And then instead of coming out because he was the only hostage negotiator, or calling the next chain of command to send out SWAT or more officers, he fell back to sleep. And so it continued on for the evening, the mishaps. Myself and my younger brother waited in the house for 2 hours with everyone deceased in the home. And finally, after 6 hours from the initial 911 call, the RCMP came into our home, and the paramedics rescued myself and my younger brother. So There was many problems afterwards, obviously, with trauma and mental health issues. I later lost my brother, my oldest brother, at the age of 29 by suicide. So.
Oh my God. And you're saying that the officer fell asleep?
Yes, he fell back asleep. There was an inquiry into the RCMP's misconduct. However, I believe that if times were now, if that 1993 incident happened now, it would be a much different outcome. The judge who was looking over the inquiry blamed the townspeople and said that they should have done more to protect my mother and father. And one RCMP officer took the stand and said that only Sherry, my mother, would have known the grave danger she was in and that she should have done more. So
they took no responsibility.
No responsibility. There was also a mishap in the proceedings of the court case as well. It should have went to criminal court, considering there was death threats and they had a restraining order against him, but it was accidentally put in front of a family crown and attorney, and he took it on. There's no really rhyme or reason that, in all the court documents, they don't really explain why. It was just by accident, by chance, he took it. And so they were actually moving forward with mediation. And so my mother had lost complete faith in the justice system. My father was genuinely scared. This was someone he had grown up with, and he was coined by the media as a town bully. So it's really important to me to have this walk and to bring awareness, because it wasn't until the national inquiry, till the closing ceremonies, that I realized that I was the girl. Statistically, I'm 12% more likely to go missing or be murdered. And I realized what I had missed out on, because I say I'm very privileged in the sense that I've always had my traditions and my culture to a certain degree while living here in Ontario. Obviously, that's not the same if you're removed from your community, but I had the privilege of going back to it, a couple months a year in the summertime when I was little. And so it wasn't really until I was older that I realized I had been missing out on a lot. And I had identity trauma of not knowing who I was. And obviously the generation I grew up when I first moved to Niagara, the first student that ever came up to me in a brand new school said, asked, "You're Fallon, right?" "Yes." "Your parents were killed?" "Yes." I was 9. I didn't know what to say. I was kind of shocked. And then she said, "So you're Indian. What part of you is Indian, your mom or your dad?" And, at 9, not really being able to explain, not really half of anything as a Métis, as Indigenous. I am Indigenous. I am Métis. So realizing that later on as an adult, now I have 3 children of my own, and I want to ensure that they grow up knowing who they are. What they choose to do with that is up to them, if they want to make those connections with their culture. And it's really important to me, not only for my children and myself, but for my father, to honor him with his grandchildren, knowing who they are, because they are a part of him.
What were your parents' names?
Sherry and Morris Paul.
Fallon, thank you so much for being open and sharing with us. I appreciate it. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes with Fallon and chat a little bit more. Stay with us.
Okay.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with Fallon Farinacci. She's told us just now a very powerful story about growing up in Manitoba and a stalker entering her childhood house and murdering her mother and her father, and having to live with that trauma. Wow. That's very powerful. I can't imagine. I can't imagine what you've gone through. Maybe I can change the topic a little bit for a second, Fallon. When we were chatting earlier, you said that you thought that this was a genocide. Tell me why you think the way that Canada has treated its Indigenous people has been a genocide.
Well, when you've stripped a group of people of their knowing and their ways of living, when you have knowingly put them in places like residential schools and reserves and taken away their traditions and cultures, and the agenda was to remove the Indian within the child, so stripping them of who they are and the impacts of these systems that have been put into place and how they've impacted the communities. To me, it's very clear on my end that would be a genocide. There are so many systems that are in place or were in place that have endangered Indigenous folks and have made this not a safe place.
Do you think the RCMP had a prejudice against the Métis people in your community, against your parents, against your people?
I would say that there's more than likely within that police station. It was about 40 minutes from my community, just outside of Winnipeg. There is a very high Métis population within the Red River area where I'm from. There's a high chance that there were Métis RCMP officers, Métis RCMP officers. Do I think that they unknowingly, I can't even say that they knowingly did. I'm going to assume that yes, some definitely had a prejudice against Indigenous people or Métis folks. But do I believe that some unknowingly did as well? Yeah, I do. One of the officers who took my mother's original statement, actually I believe I was in grade 11 or grade 12. So to just give you a little bit of a story here, I did move back to Manitoba for a few years in high school. I fought really hard. I wanted to go back. I wanted to graduate with my friends, the people I had known since basically I was born. And it was a huge part of my fight to go back there. And so I did. And I can't remember if it was in grade 11 or grade 12. But nonetheless, I was leaving a party and I was the DD. I was driving down a highway, and instead of going straight into the community where I was dropping a friend off, I merged onto the highway, just like you do for me in Niagara, the QEW is utilized to get through the city a lot quicker. So that's what I was doing here. And then I had a police or RCMP officer put his lights on and pulled me over. And he pulled me over and he said he saw that I was leaving a party, and the way I was driving, he thought I had been drinking. He nearly ran me into the ditch. My vehicle was about on its angled quite a bit. And he told me to get out of the vehicle. I was 16, 17 at the time. I had no idea of any rights of what to do. And so obviously I got out and I listened, and he put me in the back of his cruiser. He made me take a breathalyzer. First, he indicated that I didn't do it properly, so I must be a smoker. And then I did it again, and that's when I passed it. And I told him, well, no, I don't smoke. It worked. And if you look over there to the left where my high school was, there's a big sign there, and it said TAD on it. So Teenagers Against Drinking and Driving. And at that moment I was able to say, that's my name on that sign. and I have not been drinking. And that was the same officer who didn't tell the judge that my mother's stalker had a 22 caliber rifle, and then he pulled me over. He knew who I was. Our community was small. When you saw these folks within our community, some of them lived in our community or neighboring communities. But either way, I often think back to that because I do wonder how much of it impacted them coming to our community. The man who was the stalker of my mother, he was also Indigenous. He was Métis. And I can't, sit here and say that the system failed me, the system failed me. So I shock people usually when I say this, because the system failed him as well. He had mental health issues. Where did those stem from? What was it? What in his history of being an Indigenous man led him to being an alcoholic, a drug user, going in and out of the system, being arrested, I believe 13 or 11, I can't remember, prior times. So yes, I do believe that to a certain degree, there were more issues around us being Indigenous or being an Indigenous community. And in these Indigenous communities, we're under-policed and over-policed. The closest RCMP office or station was actually 20 minutes from our community, but that RCMP office didn't cover our area. The one that was 40 minutes did. And for whatever reason, I'm not saying that that was on purpose. I'm sure there was a method to that. However, that station at that time closed at 2 a.m. So if there were proper systems or policing available within rural Indigenous communities, then maybe we wouldn't see the problems that we see.
In the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, one of the attitudes, one of the findings, I think, was that that police, that investigators, that the public at large may not have paid as much attention to missing people from Indigenous communities as they would have from other communities. And I interviewed someone just a week ago about this mass shooter in Nova Scotia, and he preyed on sex workers and on Indigenous people and sex workers, and the contention, they did a major research study, and one of the findings is that there was this attitude that sex workers and Indigenous people, and I'm not trying to connect the two, I'm just saying that those two groups were thought of as almost not as worthy of protection as someone else in society. What do you think? Were Indigenous missing and murdered Indigenous women and children thought of as less worthy of protection, less worthy of attention?
Yeah, absolutely. I can say that 100%. I grew up feeling not enough, not worthy. It's something as an adult that I have to consciously fight myself, my own thoughts over, because I've been told this for so long. In 2021, I started a GoFundMe because I was going to be turning 38 that year. I called it the Celebrate Indigenous Resilience fundraiser. And it was a crutch, whatever you might call it. It worked for me. It was something I wanted to do and to be clear, the GoFundMe was not for myself. It was for 2 Indigenous organizations. And that I have to celebrate the fact that I am still here, because for years I've self-sabotaged, especially around my birthday, because I had the survivor's guilt that I was still here. And why was I still here? I just didn't feel that I should be still here. So I had to shift the narrative and turn it around and force myself to celebrate the fact that I am still here and that I was going to be the first person in my immediate family to turn the age of 38. So I started this GoFundMe. I got it all set up. And as I said, the funds were going to go to 2 Indigenous organizations, one here in the Niagara region and one in my home community. And I was about to press enter and get the GoFundMe going. And I had one of the worst anxiety, panic attacks, and depressed states that I can't say that I've ever had, but one of the top, because it was the realization, what if no one cares? No one cared for so long. I mean, the judge said, the police said, the 911 operator who hung up on me when I called for help told me in other words or actions that I don't matter. And so I almost didn't press enter. It took a lot out of me. And I have no idea what overcome my mind and my body, but I pressed enter. And I was worried about the reality of, you know, it being right in my face that no one cared, but also not wanting to let those 2 organizations down. I press enter, and with the power of social media and media itself, within 24 hours, the GoFundMe raised $10,000. It blew the $3,800 goal out of the water. And by the end, I say the end, it wasn't the end, but the date that I would be presenting the checks to both organizations, it was the date. It wasn't my birthday, but it was one day plus my father's age when he died. So it was 37 and however many days. To that date, we had raised, I believe it was at 96 or 91,000 that day. And then by the first Truth and Reconciliation Day, it had hit over $100,000. And to date, because I never took it down, it's raised over $106,000. And both organizations have received their funds. So in a long answer, yes, I do believe that history has told us that, or made us want to make us believe that we are less worthy and that we are not deserving.
But with the 106,000 and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, are things improving? Are things changing for the better?
I don't think so. I mean, the $106,000 helps the communities. It helps these 2 organizations receive funds that they might not necessarily get. Does it improve their services? Absolutely, 100%. Has those services helped these Indigenous communities? 100%. But is enough being done with the national inquiry and PRC, the calls to action, the calls to justice? No. When those calls to action and calls to justice are answered, then only then we'll really start to see improving. But I don't know if we'll see it improving if they're not put into place. I mean, in Winnipeg, there was just a serial killer killing Indigenous women there. They're currently fighting to search the landfill. I should say fighting. There's also a report being done to search that landfill. But I remember when those bodies were first found, the media shared, I don't remember what outlet it was, but shared that there was a man, in Toronto who went missing, and they knew that his body was in a landfill last year, and they searched that landfill for him. So I do wonder. I don't have an answer as to what will make it better, but the best I can say is that being on the National Family Advisory Circle and sitting alongside other family members and survivors and coming together and actually putting together those calls for justice, having the issue that happened to your family. So say for my family, not having policing within a rural Indigenous community. Well, if you can implement to have that, have more of those services, then maybe, I understand these are a lot of maybes. If something was different, if I try not to live in the past, but if it can possibly help someone in the future, then yes, I'm going to say that. If maybe those services were in place, or if this was implemented, then things could be different for someone else.
If people listening tonight want to donate to your GoFundMe page, can they find it? Where is it?
Yeah, they can, if they just Google GoFundMe Indigenous Resilience, it will come up for them. So, as I said, the funds continue to come in, and we've raised more than $106,000 locally. I've worked with a couple, or one specifically, but a couple organizations where we held a fundraiser in December for the last couple of years. My birthday's in December, and so this is how I like to celebrate it, by coming together with community members, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and we come together to raise more funds. So
GoFundMe Indigenous Resilience.
yes.
We're going to take a break and come back in 2 minutes with Fallon Farinacci.
You got it.
In just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about Red Dress Day on May 5th with Fallon Farinacci, who is Métis, has had really just an unbelievably interesting, difficult, harrowing experience as a young child, and has really become involved in and passionate about Indigenous rights and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and Red Dress Day, and her GoFundMe site for Indigenous resilience. And it's good to hear your story. It's difficult to hear your story, but it's good to hear your story. So thank you very much for sharing it with us. Let me ask you about the inquiry. The inquiry about missing and murdered Indigenous girls, women and girls. Was that helpful to have for Canada, for Indigenous people, for you, do you think?
I can only speak for myself. So I that's the teaching that I've been taught. So I will speak for myself. Okay. Yes. For me, it did.
Why?
It helped me. One, it helped me realize that as much as I believed I was connected to my community and my culture, I wasn't. That as much as I say it helped me, it also put me in a new place of healing that I didn't even know that I had to embark on. A whole new journey. It was as though healing all those years, not that I had been healed or ever will be, but all of my years growing up till that point, I thought I was healed, or not healed, sorry. I had healed from certain things. And once I started the inquiry and I started to be around other family members and survivors, it was then that I realized that I wasn't alone, that there were people out there who had very similar stories to mine. I met two people that had almost identical stories to mine. And it just made me realize, one, that I wasn't alone. However, it did open up a whole lot to deal with, considering that there were more people out there like me. it made it harder to deal with that notion, like I said earlier, about not being enough and the reality that it was happening to other people. But realization of not being as connected to my community and culture and traditions allowed me to call it back, to start on that journey. It's not an easy journey by any means, but I was ready to do that, to do the work, to really connect. And I often think about my father and my grandfather, and I think my father was so proud. This is my thoughts, of course, because my grandfather passed away, so I can't really ask him. Everyone in our community who knew my father would tell you he's very proud Métis man. I don't remember my grandfather being the same as my father, and so I wonder, was my father doing the work to reconnect and reclaim more? And so I want to continue down that journey. And it also introduced me to friends and people I call my family now that you can't change anything. I can't go back. I could wish and wish for them to be back and not to have gone through what I've gone through. And it's not to say that I wouldn't in a heartbeat take them back and do it all over again if I could, but I can't. So what I can say is that I have an enormous group of family and friends around me who love and support me and help me on this journey of reclaiming and reconnecting. And so for that part of it, I'm thankful that I was at least led in that direction, because if I didn't testify, I don't know if I would have really gone down that journey of reconnecting as much as I have, because I wouldn't have been aware of what I was missing out on. So
I think all Canadians have become far more aware of lots of these issues in the last couple of years because of the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, because of this incredible finding of buried children at the residential schools. There's been a real attention to Indigenous issues and how we've done such a terrible job in dealing with our brothers, our country people, etc. And I think that people become far more aware of the need for this reconciliation, and our Prime Minister has certainly paid a lot of attention to it. But at the same time, some people are saying that it's too much of a focus and that it is, it's apologizing too much about our history. How do you feel about this issue, about what Canada should be doing in regards to its relationship with Indigenous people?
Okay. In November of 2022, I had the honor of listening. I was in a Zoom with Jesse Wente, and we were talking about his book, Unreconciled. And these are not my words. So again, I've been taught to acknowledge who the words are from. And it's Jesse Wente who said this. He gave this incredible story about a bike. Okay. And in that story, he had a bike stolen. And so again, I'm sure he'd be okay with me sharing this part of it. And it was very simply put, Canada apologized for taking what they took from us, but they never gave it back. In what scenario could you ever apologize and not give something back? It was just so simple. I thought, oh my gosh, and like I get asked all the time, what does reconciliation look like to me? And I was just like blown away when he said this. So, I mean, it's Jesse Wente to me. He's that call just will stay with me until the end of of time. I took a lot away from that night. I do agree that people do say that, you know. I'm sure someone might be listening and being like, how are people tired of that? They couldn't be tired of that. I would hope that they're not, but just not this past Sunday. The Sunday before that, I was in downtown St. Catharines putting up signs for the May 5th walk. We have this great local cafe that has a community board. So I was in there and I was putting up the sign. I had an elderly woman come up to me and say, oh, what is that? What is Red Dress Day? I started explaining it to her. And then I, honest to goodness, thought she was going to say, oh, I'm so tired of this happening to folks. No, nope. I was met with quite the opposite. I'm so sick and tired about hearing about Indigenous people. You got an apology from the Pope, and don't you get billions of dollars? What more do you want? Is what she said to me. I was shocked. I've been shocked before, but I was paralyzed. I had my 5-year-old son with me. And I looked at this woman and I just explained that her thoughts were part of her white privilege and that I thought she was disgusting. She was shocked by what I said, but I walked away because I thought I need to keep my peace. And she wasn't even fazed by it. I know that she wasn't even fazed by it and that I didn't have to go into anything more of telling her of my side of why I thought, you know, that it was an important date. When she walked past me and looked at the barista and, bye, have a great day. She said literally like not even 2 feet from my shoulder. And then that's when the barista said that she was a problematic customer and that they have issues with her. So I thought, okay, well, I'm happy I didn't say anything more because I would have just been talking to a wall at that point, right? So it upset me deeply, especially because I had my young one with me. And as a mom, you know, I don't want him to hear those kinds of things, although, you know, you can't protect your kids from from everything. I was visibly upset. He knew. He picked me a dandelion and gave me one and said specifically because it was for that lady. But then I thought, no, there has to be a teaching in this. It took me a lifetime to use that method to try to make sense of something. And so I thought, okay, just because this is tough doesn't mean that you can't use that tool that you've, you know, so desperately have taught yourself to use when dealing with things. So I asked myself, what's the teaching in this? And I thought, well, there's a reason for the walk. She just proved to me why.
Yep. Well, I think you've done a good job with your son. He showed great empathy in giving you that dandelion.
Yeah.
We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Fallon Farinacci. She has told us about Red Dress Day, May 5th, about a walk that's happening in St. Catharines, and I presume in numerous other cities around Ontario, Canada, North America, etc., to bring awareness to missing and murdered Indigenous women and children and other issues in regards to Indigenous people. And Fallon has been very open and shared with us her own story, which is heartbreaking, but also really does give your example of Indigenous resilience, your GoFundMe page, and your own personal capabilities. And we're so happy that you've been so resilient and that you've taught empathy to your 5-year-old son that gives you dandelions when you're feeling bad and you've met bad people, and the example that you're sharing. I interviewed a bunch of people, when was it, 2 years ago when we had the George Floyd issues, numerous African Canadians, Black people who, and I think a lot of Canadians, understand anti-Black racism, but when they started talking about white privilege, they didn't understand that. And you used the word white privilege. Can you explain to us what you think white privilege is, and does it exist?
When you can't see beyond yourself. When you can't even put yourself in someone else's shoes in the scenario to really wrap your head around it. You can't remove yourself or your ways of thinking from the issue. To me, that's what white privilege is.
And it exists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You said you wanted to leave me with, and leave our listeners with some calls to action?
Yeah, absolutely. Call to action. Read the 231 calls for justice. I talk to young people even about this, and I break it down so simple. There's 231 calls for justice. There are calls for justice specifically for Canadians. They're simple. Brian, by you having me on here as part of media, you've answered a call for justice. You have given me a space to share as an Indigenous woman, to share my story. So you work within media. You've helped implement one of those calls for justice. There are calls for justice for healthcare workers or those who work within healthcare, the justice system as well, policing, education. It's so simple. What do we all naturally do? We network in a sense, right? You hear an opportunity, you hear of to make it really simple, you hear of a sale of something that someone's going to want or like, or there's a job opportunity. What do? We share that. So what I encourage people to do, I even encourage young youth to do this as well. Read the calls for justice, and then in conversation, it will naturally come up for you to talk about, oh, you know what? I know someone that might be able to actually implement this within their workspace or their personal life, however it might be. So they are attainable. Not all of them are about policy changes. Obviously, a lot of them will have to come but from up top, I would say. However, grassroots, right here. This is how we implement them. This is how we bring change. And so I'm just encouraging everyone to do that. And there are stories just like mine behind every single one of those calls for justice. Not one came from thin air. They came from lived, horrific, traumatic experiences. And I'll leave you with this. I had an elder once say in a meeting that I was in a gathering that I was in, she said, "You can't unhear what I said to you today. So what will you do with it?"
Fallon Farinacci, thank you so much for joining us and telling us about Red Dress Day on May 5th and raising awareness for all of these issues. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.